Hello, everybody. It is June 2020. We are still under a massive pandemic coronavirus lockdown, although here in Mississippi, as you can see, we are allowed to gather in small groups. And it is once again time for Health State Debate. If you're watching this, congratulations. That either means you have qualified to NSDA in public forum, which is fantastic. Or if not, you're just watching this to get better at debate and learn about it. Maybe be ready to watch some rounds in NSDA, and that's awesome too. So so congratulations. My name is Brett Harvey. I'm the coach of the debate team here at Mississippi State. I have Mia Robertson with me. Mia is uniquely qualified on this. She debated for 2 years in high school. Both years went to NSDA. Both years went to out rounds. Her senior year went to round 10. So she knows all about it. We're going to benefit from her expertise. And I have to brag on her because this year, as a freshman in college, she was the JV season-long national champion in our league, which is IPDA. So good job. Fantastic.
Thank you.
Oh, well done. Okay.
Thank you.
So what we're going to do is the usual, which is we're going to start with some general thoughts and then move on to a more in-depth discussion of the topic. As always, the links and timestamps are going to be in the description below, so you can look there for those. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, we are at Hail State Debate. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't say that the topic is, on balance, charter schools are beneficial to the quality of education in the United States. My general thoughts on this is, I think it's a pretty good topic. I think the NSDA did a good job wording it. I think the phrase beneficial to the quality of education is a really good way to kind of narrow the topic down a little bit. Otherwise, it could have been kind of unwieldy because this is such a potentially broad topic, but I think they did a nice job of making it manageable while still leaving a lot of room for creativity. I will say for me personally, charter schools are not my favorite area to talk about just because it becomes such an evidence fight, which I think Mia is going to talk about in just a little bit, and the data is so mixed and everything. But within that world, it is, I think, really well worded. I would also say I think there's a little bit of a con side bias, but it's not huge, just because I think maybe there's a little bit of a paucity of evidence to really kind of seal the deal for the pro, and your typical judge, particularly at a tournament like NSDA, might be inclined to view the pro as having a little bit more of a burden of proof, even though technically we know in PF that is not true. So I might say there's a little bit of a slant toward the con, but overall I think it's a good, well-balanced topic, and I think obviously there's going to be some fantastic debates on it. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I also like the topic. I do think there's a lot of literature on both sides, but I will say one concern that I do have is that I'm scared that the evidence that's available to us isn't as broad as this resolution is. Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be a little bit hard to find evidence that isn't just going to be dismissed by your opponent as an outlier or too specific. So watch out for that and make sure you're trying to find evidence that actually encompasses what the resolution is asking for.
Yeah, because as we're going to talk about in a second, the choice to use the phrase on balance and in the United States really does kind of herd the debate toward a broad national discussion. And it's very hard to do studies like that. There are very few of them. So
yeah, especially after only 2 decades or so.
Yeah.
Also, I think a lot of rounds are going to devolve into some definition fights. I think you're probably going to be spending quite a bit of time, at least in your rebuttals, arguing over the definition of quality of education, which is a necessary thing and will probably benefit your side if you're prepared for it. But we all know in public forum, definition fights just aren't fun. So that's my concern.
I'm 100% on board with that. And I think I'll probably say this again later, but I really do believe that this is just as much. I mean, obviously, if somebody asks you, what are you debating about at nationals, you're going to say charter schools. But the truth is, this is as much a debate about what it means to say the quality of education. Like, what is quality education? And I think the teams that are going to make it into the late out rounds are going to be the ones who are almost as well prepared to debate about like what really matters in education and have cards and blocks and things on that, as opposed to just debating charter schools and be able to say, no, this metric is more important than that metric. I absolutely agree with that. So in terms of like the order of the video, if you've watched this before, it's going to be basically the same. We are going to spend a few minutes at the beginning talking about sort of general advice on the NSDA tournament. And in particular, it is a very unique tournament. There's nothing else like it, not only in high school debate, but anywhere in the forensics world. So we're going to talk about that, talk a little bit about online debating and how to adapt to this year's hopefully only ever online tournament. I mean, hopefully this doesn't become a regular thing, but you have to wrestle with it. Then we're going to do a topic overview with some general thoughts, definitions and framework, pro arguments, con arguments, and then we will get to our final thoughts. So with that, we will jump right into some thoughts about this particular tournament that you have gotten yourself into. Okay, so NSDA, if you've never been before, and statistically, most of you have never been before because you got to qualify. It is a fundamentally different kind of tournament, and this year it's even more different because we're doing it online. But a lot of the factors that make it unique are going to, I think, carry over, and then we're going to have some new stuff on top of that. So we've got the expert here. We've got somebody who's been about as far as most people have ever gone. So, Mia, I'm going to throw it to you, and you tell us, what does it take to win at NSDA?
Well, I wish I knew exactly how to win an SDA.
Well, to win at NSDA. I'm not to win the whole thing. You only debated for 2 years, you know. I mean, if you had 2 more, you would have won it, but like to win at NSDA.
Yeah, for sure. So first of all, congratulations, especially if it's your first time. You should be very proud of yourselves. Now, first of all, about NSDA, there are a lot of misconceptions that may frighten you a little bit before you go for your first time. I remember my junior year, right before I was going to NSDA, I assumed that NSDA was going to be this incredibly technical tournament where there was going to be a lot of jargon thrown around, and I was absolutely terrified of that fact. Now, that is partly true. A ton of your competitors are going to be very technical, and a lot of your judges are going to be very technical too. Check their paradigms because they'll tell you beforehand. But one thing that you need to remember, even at NSDA, a very technical tournament, clear storytelling is still very important. And you still need about an equal balance of both evidence and technicality and clear storytelling, having a very clear thesis of your argument and telling it succinctly and clearly to your judge.
You know, as somebody who has been judging at NSDA a long time ago, went to back when it was called NFL, National Forensic League, has been, I would say that's exactly right. I think NSDA is kind of a crossroads where different styles of debate meet, right? And whether you view it as a technical tournament or a very non-technical tournament depends on your baseline, like where you're coming from, right? If you come from a more traditional circuit like Mississippi, it's going to be a more technical tournament than you're used to. If you are debating, you know, on the national circuit with TOC type teams, it's going to be much more of a rhetorical speaking kind of thing than you're used to. But pretty much everybody, one way or the other, is going to have to adapt to something they're not used to. The question is just which direction you're going to have to go in, right?
Yeah, certainly don't make the mistake that I made. My senior year, we were going into round 10, and because we were so far into the competition, we said, okay, we need to ramp up the technicality, we need to make all the extensions, absolutely no drops. Of course, those things are important, but round 10, we lost that round, and all 3 judges said the reason why is because we didn't have a clear story. We had muddied the water so much because all that we were focusing on was evidence fights, and all we were focusing on was extensions and drops, and we weren't making it clear to our judge. So even though technicality is going to be really important here, especially on a topic like this where the evidence is so mixed and where a lot of the results are honestly pretty insignificant or inconclusive, a clear story could be the difference between a win and a loss.
Yeah, I think you've got to remember, if you're not familiar with NSDA, your judging pool is going to come from all over the map, right? Some people say, you know, oh, it's a lay-friendly tournament. It's got more lay judges than you would see at like a TOC or another big tournament. The truth is, it's a widely mixed judging pool. You have pretty much, in a typical year when you're actually traveling to it, the real deciding factor for who's judging at NSDA is who can go for a week. Right. And that's what decides it. So you end up seeing a lot of like parents, right? And the coaches themselves end up judging. But, you know, even among the coaches, there's wide variation. There's super technical people. There's people who are, individual events coaches who've been drafted to judge debate because that's just who made it from their school. All kinds of different folks. And I think, as Mia says, number one, if they have a paradigm, read it. That's probably going to suggest they're a more technical judge. If they don't have a paradigm, you know, you're going to have this check-in period that they describe in the rules. And there's absolutely nothing wrong in a virtual environment, as always, of just asking, you know, what do you like to see in debate, right? And if they tell you, whatever they tell you, you know, try to do it to the best of your ability. And I think that, you know, but I do think, you know, in terms of storytelling and pulling back and making the picture clear on these topics where it's just evidence fights and whose study has a better regression analysis, you've got to be able to have the understanding of the topic where you can just pull back and say, look, at the end of the day, here's the question you need to be asking yourself. And teams that don't do that are going to have a real hard time making it through 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, however many rounds, right?
Yeah, another piece of advice that I'd give is, especially if you've been to NSDA before, you know that traditionally people really don't read definitions. It's just not what you do. You don't want to spend the time on it. But on this topic, I actually would read a definition for quality of education. And the reason why I say that is because it's just such a subjective term. And at the very beginning of the round, you want to set out the metric that you're going to be using for your case and how you're determining what a quality education is. I would actually also have a pretty sizable amount of blocks for just comparing your metric to others and why your metric for quality of education is better than whatever your opponent's is. And I think the teams that do that are going to be the ones who have a great advantage.
Yeah, if you're not, I mean, there's only so much a judge, particularly when they're judging double flighted rounds, there's only so much that a human being can stand in terms of saying, well, you know, your regression analysis didn't include this factor and it wasn't a double blind study. At some point, you know, teams that are not just doing that, who are coming in and saying, look, test scores are fine, but they don't matter if they don't result in people actually having better, you know, graduation rates or better college acceptance rates or some measurable thing. I'm not saying that specific argument, but arguments like that, where you're prepared to, and you have warrants for it and sources for it, and you're ready to argue about like what really matters in education, I think are going to be super important. Because remember, these judges are human beings too, and even though they are in the comfort of their own home, you know, judging online in a meeting, you know, for your 8th round of the day or whatever, my gosh, you know, they just want to have a story told to them at some point, and teams that can do that will have an advantage. So talking a little bit about speaking of in the comfort of your own home, talking a little bit about online debating, just a few quick thoughts. First and obviously, make sure you read, you know, this is a no-brainer, but make sure you read the tournament procedures that NSDA has put out. They may very well have some updates and addendums in the coming days and weeks. So make sure you are absolutely up to speed on whatever they say is going to happen. Things like how you're going to be sharing evidence, when you're supposed to check into the round, like the fact that even if you're the second flighted debate, you're supposed to still check in 30 minutes before the first debate, that kind of stuff. Just make sure you know it. If you aren't sure about something, either you or your coach can email NSDA and ask a question, but just make sure you got all that nailed down, because you don't want to be fumbling around the day of the tournament trying to figure that out. In terms of partner-to-partner communication, obviously, if your state and municipality are going to allow it, it's going to be much easier if the two of you are physically present in the same room, because then you just hit mute on the microphone and, you know, you can confer all you want. You know, even surreptitiously, quietly while the other team is talking, as long as you don't like look like you're going, you know, back and forth. So if you can do that, and obviously your parents and everyone is okay with it, that's probably the simplest thing. And my guess would be the way we're starting to see things open up in most areas, right? You would be able to do that. But that said, you know, I would definitely have a backup plan, because, you know, with coronavirus, you never know what's going to happen. With NSDA, you never know what's going to happen. I think they made a special rule in duo and terp that even if you are illegally allowed to be together in the same room for duo, you're going to have to shoot your video separately, because not everybody can be together. So who knows, right? You never know what's going to happen. There may be a scenario where you have to be physically separate, and just have a backup plan. Are you going to be talking on your cell phone? Are you going to be texting? Whatever, just know what that is. You know, even if you get halfway into the tournament, you just never know. So be ready on that. Another piece of advice would be go ahead and wear the full suit, right? Go ahead and put on whatever you would wear for competition. Some judges in an online tournament don't care, but some do. Parent judges do in most cases. It's never going to hurt you, right? It's never going to be a bad idea. And for me, you know, when I'm on these online meetings, having the suit on makes me feel like just a little bit more organized and professional. It's like a psychological thing. I mean, I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah.
So go ahead and wear the suit. Don't let anybody tell you not to. In terms of your physical setup, right, this is actually, I think, kind of an advantage that you have. Like, you know, in regular debate, you've got to lug your laptop around with you, any physical files and cases that you have with you, right, set it up quickly, tear it down quickly, and move it all over the place. In this case, you have the ability to kind of customize your setup how you want it, to find a room somewhere and set it all up and have it be the same. A few recommendations would be, number one, I would definitely try to get a hold of an external microphone if I can. We've got I think it's called a Yeti mic here, but you don't have to get something that fancy. Just something that has good, clear audio. And if your laptop is fantastic already, then great. Go with that. But if it's not and it's a little fuzzy, A good mic. It's going to be important when you get into those rebuttals and you're going fast and you want your speech to be very, very clear. You don't. I am not saying buy it. For God's sake, don't buy it. But somebody at your school somewhere in some lab or something is going to have some microphone that you can borrow. So figure out a way to borrow one if the audio is not fantastic. You might also consider having a separate camera, just because that's more aesthetic. Right, having a camera where it's shooting like it's shooting us in this video is going to be just more professional looking than if it's like you're hunched over a laptop and it's like looking up at you and that sort of thing. Shouldn't matter, probably won't matter to most judges, but why not, right? And again, it's something you can borrow. In terms of like setup, I would strongly consider, having more than one monitor, right? Maybe one, if you have two monitors like I do in my office, great. Or you can just have one regular desktop monitor and then use your laptop, right? But either way, one should be for the Zoom call itself, right? Where you've got everybody lined up and you're seeing their faces and reading them, right? And the other should be for your evidence. And the good thing is, like on your evidence, you can take time to set it up exactly how you want. You can have 20 tabs if you want. You can do it however you like and get it exactly perfect and not have to like turn it off and turn it back on. So fiddle with it, play with it, see what the best, setup is for you and just stick with that. And then the last thing I would say is practice. You should have at least one practice round with some other team via this, online mechanism to try it out. Don't let your first round at Nationals be the first time you've ever done an online round. Go ahead and do that now. Any thoughts you got about online? Have you ever had to do an online debate before?
I have never done an online debate before. I wish I had more insight, but it's my first pandemic, so first time.
Well, hopefully it's your only pandemic, because what was the last one, like 1918 or whatever? Hopefully it's the only one for all of us, but, we'll see. So anyway, those are some thoughts about NSDA and going online at NSDA, and without further ado, then we will jump into the substance and do the topic overview. Okay, so let's get started on the substance with a little bit of a topic overview. Now, I know your time is valuable, ours is too, and frankly, it would be a huge waste of both of our time for me to sit here and just sort of read you the history of charter schools. It's an interesting history. Back in the 1990s, we started seeing states allow for charter schools. And, we will obviously talk about that through the video, but it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to sort of read that to you when there are many, many good sources out there, many good videos you can watch. So I'm going to recommend one, and that is the video of what's the Intelligence Squared debate on charter schools. I think it was from back in 2017. We'll drop a link to it below, but you might be thinking, wouldn't it be neat if there were an actual 2-on-2 debate between experts in this field about like whether charter schools are good? I think the resolution was like charter schools are overrated or something like that. And it's very good. Now, is it like a PF debate? No, mercifully it's not. They're not going to be, at each other's throats about particular sources. But I think what it's valuable for is not like you would model your actual debate round after it, but it shows you kind of what people in the real world debate about when they debate this topic. What do they actually argue and contest? What do they concede, right? How do they talk, right? It lets you sort of see what a serious adult sounds like with expertise talking about this, and that's going to help you shape your case to be more like that. Now, are you going to have to dive in and fight about a particular source here and there? Of course you are, but this is a good model to sort of understand what a real world debate on this is like. And notice, one thing you'll notice when you watch the video is they are not, for the most part, beating each other over the head with statistics. Now, again, in PF, you're going to have to use plenty of statistics, but I think the reason that they're not is both sides basically concede at the beginning of the debate that the statistics and the benefits on one side or the other are very small and very mixed, and the signals that are coming out of the data are not super clear. And what they do then is they try to explain why, given this mixed data and given this unclear signal, charter schools are good or bad, understanding that the data set is kind of all over the place. Well, that's a super valuable skill to have, as we've been talking about. That arguing about what a quality education is and how to interpret the data is important. So I would just say, for overview on the topic, watch the video, and we will put some other links to sort of good background information as well. So.
Yeah, and talking about statistics, it's incredibly important at NSDA, and specifically on this topic, that you know your sources and that you know your evidence. Because at least in my experience, every team is going to have read pretty much every card. I know my partner and I's favorite thing to do was just know somebody else's card and read it back to them and just pick it apart. So a lot of teams at NSDA are going to be doing that. Now, especially on this topic, it's going to be important that you know where your sources are coming from, because just frankly, there's a lot of money at stake, and there are a lot of people with a lot of vested interests who are doing a lot of research studies and citing a lot of stats. So it's going to be really easy for your evidence to get just completely disregarded if it comes from a source like that.
I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there is a video on YouTube of a highly regarded PF debater. I think it was national champions from a few years back, in the national finals, asking another debater, do you know what happened to the source you just read? And she was forced to admit what he told her. Isn't it true that it was turned out to be falsified, and that the person who put it forward had to resign in disgrace, and she had to admit that? Well, in front of God and the whole world in the national finals. Well, you don't want that to happen. Now, I'm not saying every round is going to be like that, because that was a uniquely good debater, but that kind of scrutiny of sources, especially when we all know going in, right, that there are that number one, as you said, there are so many of these foundations and groups that have huge money at stake when it comes to charter schools. For example, the Center for Reinventing Public Education, or CRPE, or CREEPY, as I guess the acronym would be. I mean, they're going to be extremely pro-friendly. They're going to be charter school friendly, but they clearly have a bias, right? But you're also going to see on the other side, teachers unions, labor unions for teachers, have overwhelming bias against charter schools because they think they're taking funding away. And any debater worth their salt needs to have a list of sources that raise red flags. If it comes from CRPE, right, or a person is affiliated with that, or a person who writes for a labor union publication, right off the top, even if you don't know the card, which you hopefully will, right, you should immediately have a series of questions like, who pays this person? What are the questions you ask?
So if a lot of times at NSDA, people want to be really succinct, so they'll just say Jones 19, instead of actually telling you who Jones is and who Jones is paid by and who Jones works for. So the first thing that I would ask in Crossfire, especially if they haven't listed it, is who do they work for? And pretty quickly they're going to be able to tell you if they're worth their salt.
But even better is if they can't say, isn't it true they work for, whatever, right?
So pretty quickly you'll be able to find out if it's a source that's worth listening to or not. But if they're unable to tell you, just ask them the methodology, ask them how the study was done, if they've controlled for any variables and stuff like that. Really pry into those sources.
I would even say, if you really want to do a belt and suspenders approach, there are even articles out there. We'll link to one from the Progressive just talking about CRPE. But there are articles out there and sources out there where, one group will explain the bias of the other group, right? Or Wikipedia articles and things like that will explain where their funding comes from. Now, that may be a little too much sugar for a nickel, as they say here in Mississippi, for some of you, right? But if you really, really want to be prepared to try to make a run toward those trophy rounds, late in the tournament, it is not crazy to have a block, written that attacks the bias of X group and Y group and Z group and all these other ones. Now, that's a lot. But there are going to be some teams that do that, right?
At the very least, it'll put some doubt into your judge's mind, and it'll make them think, well, maybe I can't fully trust this team who is reading me a study that's completely biased or that I can't actually trust.
Right. I think the hierarchy of sources on this is probably going to be at the top, unaffiliated academics, right? Academics, professors at universities who are not part of some center with an ideological bias. If you can find sources like that, that's what you should prioritize, because they don't have any obvious, financial ties. And then below that, you're going to have various academic centers, there's the Credo study, I think, from Stanford University. They're still pretty good, but then you're going to descend down through these interest groups and things like that get progressively worse and more biased. And the more you can get your sources from people who are just professor whatever of X university, even though they may have their ideological bent, right, generally speaking, you're going to be better off than if you are getting it directly from, say, for example, CRPE or from the, teachers union or something along those lines. One last sort of general thought about the resolution is, remember, this is a topic about education. And I don't know if you've noticed, but a huge number, pretty much everybody at this tournament is going to be directly involved in K through 12 education, either you as debaters, you're in it, right? Or coaches who are generally speaking going to be teachers, maybe a few administrators, lots of parents. There are certainly going to be charter schools at this tournament, right? Good ones. There are going to be, some of you watching this very well may be from charter schools. Some good teams are going to be from there. And it's important that you be sensitive and mindful that this is not a debate about anybody's choices, right? And I think it's important as you go through and debate that, especially if you're on the con side and you're attacking charter schools, that you make it clear, of course we concede and agree that there are some good charter schools. There are great charter schools represented at this tournament, along those lines, and be ready to sort of concede that. Don't say, nasty things that cast aspersions on the people who go to charter schools or things like that. There's really no reason to do that in the debate, but just be careful and be mindful that you very well may be debating in front of a proud teacher at a charter school on the con, and just be mindful and thoughtful about that. So those are all the thoughts I've got. You got anything else?
I'm finished.
Fantastic. All right. So without further ado, let us jump into some thoughts about the terms, the definitions, and the framework. Okay, so let's talk about definitions and framing the debate. I think this is super important. As Mia said earlier, I know that in most cases, particularly at the national level, we are not spending a lot of time reading definitions in public forum. And I'm not necessarily saying you have to read these, although I think Mia has a good point about, for example, reading a definition of what quality of education is. I really think that's important. But whether you do or don't, you need to be ready to understand how the resolution is framed if you have to have a definition or framework fight. So that's what we're going to talk about now. And, God bless. I hope you never have to use this stuff. But the thing is, you're going to have to use this stuff, right? Even if you would prefer not to, right? Okay, so let's start at the beginning with charter schools. I think charter schools should be a fairly straightforward thing. I don't think there's a lot of theoretical debate in the real world about it. Mm-hmm. But here again, we're at NSDA. You never know what kind of games people are going to play. But basically, charter schools are public schools, right, that are operated with autonomy from traditional school districts. They have a lot of regulations and rules relaxed so that they can make different choices as to how to educate students, but they're given a charter, right, from either a state body or a local body, however it's set up, that allows them to operate and to get public funding to educate students. And that means that funding is typically going to be pulled from traditional public schools. And so when we talk for the rest of the video about the distinction, we're going to say charter schools versus traditional public schools. I've been abbreviating it TPS in my notes, but traditional public schools are the ones where, they are run by the government, right? So just to be aware of that. The Webster definition is a tax-supported school established by a charter between a granting body and an outside group, which operates the school without most local and state educational regulations to achieve set goals. Well, that's a perfectly serviceable definition. In terms of knowing the background, again, we're not going to spend a ton of time just telling you the history of them, but most states, I think 43 states and the District of Columbia, have laws allowing charter schools. They have grown dramatically over the last 25 years. They really kicked off in the 1990s starting with Minnesota and California. And over the last 20 years, you've seen massive growth, jumping from less than 1% of students to about 6% of your K-12 students, with over 7,000 charter schools operating in the country. So you've seen massive growth in charter schools. If you want a definition or just something to read that has a much deeper dive into what charter schools are, we're going to link to something called Charter Schools and Perspective, which is run by the Spencer Foundation and Public Agenda. And they have this very long bullet-pointed definition of what it actually takes to be a charter school. And while I wouldn't do this, I can definitely see teams taking more nuanced academic definitions and maybe trying to use them to kind of carve in or carve out certain types of schools from their burden. For example, this definition says that part of the definition of a charter school is one that has open, non-discriminatory, non-selective admissions. So I can certainly imagine a pro team, a con team comes in and says, well, charter schools sometimes have selective admissions and that's bad. And a pro team turns around and says, oh, no. If they have selective admissions, that means by definition, according to the Spencer Foundation, they are not a charter school. Now, would I run with this? No, I think it's a hard sell. probably wouldn't buy it as a judge. But again, you've got people trying to scrape out every little advantage they can at this super tough tournament. I don't think it's beyond the possibility that you could see people try something like that.
No, I could definitely see people doing it, and it's happened to me in my experience.
Right. So, just even if you don't think you need a lengthy, long discussion of what a charter school is, read the literature on it, read the link we dropped, make sure you understand kind of what the little debates are at the margin. So if, on the off chance you run into somebody who wants to have a definition fight on this, be ready. Hopefully you won't have to. I think on balance is super, super important, particularly when you sort of couple the beginning of the resolution with the end, which is on balance and in the United States. And I think that there's a strong you could make this as an observation if you want in the case, or you can just run the case this way and come back and address it in rebuttal. But I think when you take these two terms together, there is a strong argument that this debate has to be about the overall track record of charter schools across the United States. And consequently, I think what teams, particularly con teams, but really on either side, can argue is that studies and data that focus too narrowly on any specific school or district or city or state or any other small subset, non-representative subset, are arguably irrelevant, right? Especially if there are better data sets that are nationwide or more representative, right? So put another way, you might say that these smaller studies are about whether a particular model of charter schools could work, right? About whether, in certain circumstances, charter schools could be good. But that's not what we're debating about. We are debating about whether on balance in the United States they've worked. And frankly, I think one of the cleanest, there's so much data on this, right? That you have to have a clean way to sort of narrow it down and say, here are the studies that matter, right? And one way to do that, right, is to say, look, the only studies you should be listening to, Judge, are the ones that are nationwide or very nearly nationwide in scope. These others are just little isolated blips and points in the data. And earlier when we were getting ready for this, we were talking about how, imagine a debate resolution said, on balance, Wendy's restaurants in the United States meet the health code. And you get up with this study that shows 50% of Wendy's restaurants don't meet it. And then somebody gets up and says, oh, but wait, the Wendy's in Baton Rouge is fantastic. It's clean. You could eat off the floor. Well, it doesn't really matter if the Wendy's in Baton Rouge or the Wendy's, in Idaho or whatever is clean if most of them are not. And I think one really good sorting mechanism for filtering out the noise that you are going to say doesn't matter is to say, I'm going to write my case around big, broad studies. And when they give you 5 schools in a district, we're going to say, that doesn't matter, right? So now here's the big one. Here's the one we're going to spend some time talking about, which is quality of education, right? I think, again, this resolution is as much about talking about what the quality of education is as opposed to just talking about charter schools, right? So just to frame what I'm talking about here, if you focus on, if your case is focused on metric X, which let's just say it's college graduation rates or whatever, right? And your opponent focuses on metric Y, which is going to be standardized test scores. Well, presumably both of you are going to bring some pretty strong statistics in those areas. Otherwise, why would you have written your case about it, right? So the team that wins in that round is going to be the one that is able to persuade the judges that their respective focus, their main metric, is the one you should really be thinking about, and the one that's able to sort of hit back and knock the other team's preferred metric kind of out of the round. And I think if you're not doing that, you're only really debating about half the resolution, One of the ways I wrote it down was, this is as much a resolution about what quality education is as it is a resolution about charter schools, and you need to treat it that way in your research. Really, you should be sitting down and researching strong theoretical arguments about why X matters and Y doesn't, right? Why high school graduation is more important than standardized test scores, or alternatively, why standardized test scores are a better measure than high school graduation, because maybe, you can sort of game graduation. You can just pass people forward and graduate them even if they haven't done anything. But you need to be able to, I think, make those arguments, have blocks about those arguments, have sources about those arguments, just like you have sources about, about charter schools. In terms of what the options are, there are the obvious, in other words, options for measuring the quality of education. The obvious stuff: standardized test scores, high school graduation, college acceptance, college graduation, maybe even early career outcomes. But beyond that, there are some opportunities to get a little bit creative, I think. And I don't think you have to be too creative with it, but what about options like student safety, student discipline? Is a school that has, fewer fights and fewer disruptions. Is that inherently better, even if it doesn't lead to higher standardized test scores, right? What about diversity and non-discrimination? Even if they don't link directly to a higher test score or whatever, is there an argument to be made that being educated in a more diverse or representative environment is inherently good, and that a segregated education is inherently a worse quality education, even if it doesn't link to test scores? I think there are certainly sources that suggest that that is an argument you can make. Another one that I'm going to talk about later when we get to the con is closing achievement gaps, right? There's a wealth of evidence that wealthier students in certain parts of the country get a world-class education. There are states where students in like suburban public schools get an education that would be like ranked, second or third in the world if it was by itself, whereas students, particularly students of color in lower income areas, get a terrible education in some instances. So maybe we should focus on closing achievement gaps as opposed to just raising test scores as high as they can possibly go, right? And you can even see the data break down along super narrow lines about like high school charters versus middle school charters, or English scores versus math scores. And if you really want to be super prepared, you're going to know, which one goes your way and which one goes against you. And you're going to be ready to argue that the metrics that favor you are the better metrics, and the metrics that go the other way are the worst metrics, right?
Yeah, whatever definition you choose, what I would suggest doing is making sure that your contentions link into that definition. So if I was prepping a case, what I would do is make my contentions first and then walk back and write that definition, so I can make sure that my contentions are directly related to that definition. For example, you wouldn't want to write a contention about segregation and then have a definition of quality of education about test scores without directly explaining how discrimination or segregation would lead to lower test scores.
Yeah, exactly. And, I would say, I know you're going to be tempted to use however many contentions you run. If you run 3 contentions in a case, you're going to be tempted to have them all be like different benefits or different harms of charters, right? But I would almost say that the question of what a quality education is so important and so potentially evidence heavy, it might warrant its own contention. If it doesn't, it certainly warrants a subpoint, a part of a contention, an observation, something where you establish it and you're ready to fight about it later in the round. But if it's totally absent from the case, I think you're going to be in a difficult spot. The last thing I have is the word "are." And I think the word "are" is deceptively important. Again, I wouldn't put it past somebody to argue this, but here's my thought. "Are" is a present tense verb, right? This resolution is asking what charter schools are right now. It's not asking what they have the potential to be. There are some possible pro arguments that talk about how, in the long run, charter schools reflect the market, and the market is perpetually improving and iterating upon itself. My contention would be that this resolution doesn't care. By using "are," right, it is asking what charter schools are doing right now in the United States. Are they making education better, or are they making it worse? And another corollary is the resolution doesn't really care why they're succeeding or failing, right? It doesn't say, they've tried their best. It doesn't say they probably will succeed, or even that they're just good or bad generally. It says they are beneficial. And so one corollary of that is, if you, for example, as the con, argue that charters are failing, it is no answer to say, well, they're failing, but they're not failing for any reason that's inherent to charter schools. They're just failing because the politicians got it wrong, or they designed them badly, or the laws, are not well designed, or something along those lines. The response from the con would be, it doesn't matter. This resolution, it has a value element to it, but it's almost a resolution of fact. It's just asking, are they making it better or worse? And if they're making it worse, it doesn't matter if they're making it worse because charters are just inherently the worst and they always fail, or if they're making it worse because they could succeed but they're badly designed and the way they're implemented. Either way, no excuses pro. You got to show that they work, and no excuses con. You got to show that they don't work, right? So anyway, those are my thoughts on sort of framing. I think, being aware of these, even if you don't use them in the actual round, is super important. So got anything else?
I'm good.
Okay. Well, with that, I guess we have sort of gone through all the preliminaries, and now we can finally get on to the part you've all been waiting for, which is the pro. Okay, so on the pro, I want to spend just a second kind of talking about, I guess, just sort of general observations about how I would think you might want to run it. and then kind of get into 2 or 3 major points, in terms of the evidence. And to be fair, I think the pro has a little bit of an uphill fight, just because, again, I feel like judges, particularly lay judges, even if the rules say that this is not the case, tend to expect pro or affirmative teams in debate to carry a certain burden of proof, and the evidence is just so mixed. So what's going to be really important for the pro is, as we've talked about telling stories, is to sort of cut through the noise and have a clear narrative of like, what does it take for you to vote pro, judge? How do I tell you the story that these things are good, for society overall? So a couple of quick thoughts along those lines. The first one is this, especially for the pro, is a debate about outputs and not inputs, right? So we just talked about a second ago about how this is a debate about whether this charter schools are benefiting education in the United States, not whether they might or they could or they have the potential or anything like that, right? And this is critically important to the pro because I've seen a lot of people talking about this topic, writing about the topic, doing briefs on the topic, and so much of their analysis tends to focus on like the features of charter schools that could be good, right? They get outside support. They have the ability to innovate. They are freed from restrictions, all of these things. Those are potential causes of educational benefits. They are not educational benefits, right? And the analogy I would use is if the resolution said like Toyotas get good gas mileage, well, I could come in the round and read you like 20 features that they put into a Toyota that are supposed to give it good gas mileage, that in theory would give it good gas mileage. But you know how you tell if it gets good gas mileage? You go drive it and you see if it has good gas mileage, right? And I think overwhelmingly, especially on the pro, but both sides need to kind of eschew that, like, okay, here's a feature that's potentially beneficial, and look at the actual results, right? So they have more commitment to discipline, they have, funding from corporations. None of that matters unless you can link it to, right, an actual improvement in education. And if you can link it to an improvement, a measurable improvement in education, then you don't need to spend a ton of time at an event like PF, where time is so precious, talking about the causes. And you can briefly mention and say, well, I think, the reason for it is this or that or the other. But if it's working, it doesn't matter why it's working. And if it's not working, it doesn't really matter why it's not working, right? It's just a question of, is it working? That's what this is about. And I think focusing on outputs instead of inputs is critically important. It's also much more efficient. Number 2, as far as major points, here's my core theory for the pro, right? This isn't a contention. This is just sort of the overall core theory. If I'm running a case on this, here's what I'm thinking. Basically, Judge, if I don't have to show you that charters work in every case. I don't even necessarily have to show you that charters massively move the needle overall in education, because they're optional, right? Nobody gets forced to go to a charter school. If I can show you, number 1, that charters don't make the overall system worse, right? They don't make it markedly, measurably worse, which is a burden I can meet as the pro. And then number 2, that there have been some success stories, right? That in some places, you're seeing some benefits, and maybe that there have been some small marginal benefits overall, then I should win the round, right? Because if it's not making the overall system worse, and then there are some places where the charter is working better and giving people better options, then that's a win, right? Because nobody is granted, I can even concede that there are some bad charter schools, but nobody's forced to go to those, right? The definition of a charter school is you choose to apply and you choose to go there, right? So, at the end of the day, I think one of the 2 things that the pro is really going to want to focus on is, and this, by the way, lets the pro kind of get out from underneath that burden of having to have, data that shows that the whole country is getting better, like these nationwide studies. The pro is definitely going to try to have some of those, but it lets you access more evidence, like in the District of Columbia or in New York or in New Orleans or wherever we had the following successes. And your response will be, yes, I know these things aren't happening all over the place, but I showed you why the country as a whole's education system isn't getting worse. So if DC or New York or New Orleans is winning, then that's a net win, right? And I think the 2 big things you're then going to want to prove are, number 1, that we are seeing some benefits in some places, both nationwide and more locally. And then number 2, the big thing that I think Mia's going to talk about is this is not harming, right, the schools that are left behind. This isn't harming traditional public schools. It isn't harming the public school system as a whole, right? So kind of looking to those 2 points in turn, right? So first, the way I have framed this in my notes is just the best nationwide data shows that there are net benefits from charter schools. So the big study that I was looking at was the Betts and Tang study from 2018. This is a big meta-analysis of multiple other studies. So this actually does meet that request for nationwide studies that are very broad in nature. And what this analysis finds is that there are some modest net benefits in some grade levels from charter schools overall. And this is taking a lot of large studies and aggregating them into a large meta-analysis. And the biggest thing it finds is that there are no net achievement losses overall. So Betts and Tang, I assume they pronounce it Tang, is going to be, I think, one of your go-tos on the pro. But then you can break it down further, and I think there are a lot of specific benefits you can point to. So, for example, you can argue that charter schools are most beneficial to students of color, and then this looks to the Credo study. This was done in 2013 and again in 2015, and it is a fairly broad study. One of them, the first one in 2013, looked at 27 different states. And what it found was that Black students living in poverty gained 36 days of math and 29 days of reading learning from attending charter schools, while Hispanic English language learners gained 43 additional days of reading and 50 days of math. This metric of additional learning days is a little odd and it can be a little controversial, but it just means basically like it would be as if you had that many more days in the classroom to learn by virtue of going to a charter school. 2015, another Credo study looks at 41 major urban areas and found a similar pattern again in 2015, with larger effects for Black and Hispanic students. Black students in poverty gained 59 days of math and 44 days of reading. Hispanic English language learners gained 71 days of math and 79 days of reading. Now, to be fair, these studies from Credo did actually show slight losses for white students. That they try to explain why you might see these losses, that more white students enroll in distance learning and it's not as good. But the argument would be, even if there is a downside for some students, those white students or whoever, right, don't have to go to a charter school. If they feel like the system is failing them, then they have the ability to opt out. And if it is working anywhere, particularly if it is working among students from historically marginalized communities, in higher poverty areas, people who are the most in need, then that is a net benefit to education overall, particularly because of achievement gaps and things along those lines. Another good piece of evidence, and this is summarized by the Manhattan Institute. Manhattan Institute is kind of one of those middle tier sources that is a little bit biased, but maybe not as crazy biased as some others. But they cite a bunch of sources in this article. This is from 2020, and we'll link to it. And they actually link to the specific individual sources. But they point out that, some critics object and say that charter school data is not fair, pro-charter school data is not fair because it doesn't control for the fact that maybe kids who go to charter schools have parents who are more interested, like they're the parents who bothered to apply for them to go there. So what the Manhattan Institute does is it cites a study from Chabrier and others in 2016, which is a meta-analysis of students who won the lottery to get into charter schools versus students who applied but did not win the lottery. And the idea here is that both students should be more or less equivalent because in both cases their parents cared enough to apply to try to get them into a charter school. So you should be roughly controlling for the level of parental involvement. And what they found is that even when you control for this, if you look at 15 different studies in their meta-analysis, they find positive academic effects from charter schools in 12 studies, and no statistically significant effects, no harms in the other 3. So the idea would be here, even when you control for some of the biggest factors that could kind of complicate the data, right, you're seeing overall, in most cases, a benefit, and in all cases, no harm, right? So, another critique you need to be aware of, though, is that standardized test scores are not the be-all and end-all. And I would not, as the pro or the con, build my entire case around just standardized test scores, because there is a strong argument that I would be ready to make, which is that if that's all you've got, that doesn't tell us anything about education. Education has to, at minimum, prepare you for college or for the world of work, right, and hopefully prepare you for life beyond that. But again, just looking at the Manhattan Institute, kind of summarizing other research studies that you can pull from that study, they say that, matching studies of charter high schools in 3 states found substantial benefits to college enrollment and persistence. In Chicago, attending a charter school was associated with an 18.9 percentage point increase in enrolling in a 4-year college and a 5% increase in a very selective college, and an 8.4% increase in remaining enrolled in college. And as somebody who works at a university, I can tell you that staying in college and not dropping out is one of the major things that we look for, because if you go for a year and you drop out, you just wasted a bunch of money. And it talks about how there are studies in Georgia and Florida, and maybe even in some other places, that reflect this, right? That show you have higher levels of enrollment and acceptance and staying in college. And I think that's a necessary part of pretty much any pro case if we're going to talk about the statistical benefits of charter schools. Manhattan Institute also talks about societal benefits, kind of things that you might not think about traditionally, but things like, for example, students enrolled in charter schools see a less likelihood of teen pregnancy, less likelihood of a male student being incarcerated. So that's actually a nice pushback on things like the school-to-prison pipeline, right? If we're talking about diversity, if we're talking about serving underserved and particularly people of color communities, by charter schools, the idea of reducing the likelihood of incarceration is something I would definitely be ready for if I'm writing a pro case. And again, a diversity of, I think there's something to be said if you have time for having a diversity of impacts in your pro case, right? So that your, opponent can't just focus on one thing, right? You may have decided in your head, later on, I'm really hoping that they don't come after me on these test scores because I really want to go after the test scores as my impacts, or I want to go after college admissions or whatever as my impact. But having multiple ones so that they can't effectively attack all of them is, if you are, efficient enough with it, a good idea. Now remember, you can't go in and speed read, you can't do the stuff you see at maybe TOC in public forum, but you can be efficient with how you read these things, right? And then the last one on the benefit side, again, just Manhattan Institute summing this up, is being more cost effective. And there's research from the University of Arkansas that says that, if we look at the NAEP test, which is the National Association of Educational Progress, charter schools are they basically spend money more efficiently. And in a world where we have limited education funding, we don't like to pay for good education in this country, being efficient is really important to quality education. They find that charter schools are 36% more cost effective in reading and 40% more cost effective in math. In other words, they do more with less. And in places like Arkansas and here in Mississippi, and really all across the country, doing more with less is very important. So that's an interesting argument. So the bottom line is, that's just kind of a sampling, but the truth is, there are a lot of different arguments you can make about, statistically why we are seeing better outputs. You'll notice that I have spent most of my time focusing on, the statistical outputs, like I said earlier, as opposed to trying to delve into why that's the case. I'll talk a little bit about that in just a minute. But before we do that, remember there's a second part to this theory, which is that we're not making anything worse. Charter schools are not hurting traditional public schools, and Mia has some thoughts on that.
Yeah, so regardless of whether or not you accept this interpretation of the resolution, it's going to be really important that you're prepared with these arguments and that you're able to respond to some of the harms that the con is going to bring up. So first of all, at the very minimum, there isn't much reliable nationwide evidence that charter schools are actually hurting traditional public schools. This is from Brookings in 2019. It's a pretty good card about how just right now in 2019, there was a lack of effective studies that showed that there's actually a possible harm to students in traditional public schools. Now, a lot of the harms that your opponents are going to bring up, one of them is certainly going to be that funding is taken away, that funding is taken from underfunded public schools. There are two responses to this, one that I think is a little bit weaker and one that I think is pretty tenable. First, that this isn't specific to charter schools. Anytime someone may transfer schools, assuming that their school choice within that district, funding is taken away from the school they were previously at. But second, the response that I think is a little bit more strong is that in the very long term, that funding problem goes away. And we've seen that with the Manhattan evidence that I'm going to read soon, actually, that there's actually they're actually benefiting from these charter schools existing, and even with a funding strain on those schools, they're able to succeed.
So one thing that I would say about this is that you're definitely going to see pretty much every con team come in and read evidence about how charter schools are siphoning money away from the remaining traditional public schools, and there's very strong evidence that they in fact do. But the thing that they have to do is they have to link that to an actual negative impact on the educational outcomes in the remaining traditional public schools. And, the first thing you can say, as Mia points out, is the Brookings evidence says that is your burden. It is not enough for you to come in and just say there's money flowing out of traditional public schools. You have to have actual evidence that it is resulting in worse outcomes. And so the most modest claim that we can make is just to say there is a lack of effective evidence on that. And Brookings 2019, I think, has, a strong explanation of why it's just not clear. And, to your point about the funding going away, or the funding problem going away as the years go by, I think that's a strong point.
Yeah, because on that second response that I was talking about, of course, in maybe the first year that a charter school exists and a public school may see their enrollment drop from maybe they have 2,000 students to 1,500, of course, that's going to be a really big hit in the first year. But over time, as that charter school exists for longer, of course, students are going to be transferring less frequently. Over time, teachers will retire and you just won't replace those teachers. So it's not like your fixed costs are going to remain the same forever. And over time, that problem is going to disappear.
Right. As we're going to talk about later on the con, the whole issue is that you have certain fixed costs for the school that don't go well, like heating the building and paying the principal and paying all the teachers. And yes, for year one, fine, that is going to be an issue. But over time, you're going to right size to the number of teachers you need. You will close certain traditional public schools and you won't have to pay the utility bills. And all those things will get better. And, one point you can make is like charter schools are not new. We're on year 25 now. So if your opponent has evidence about how they were siphoning money and it's from 2013 or 14, you should really be asking, well, we've seen massive growth in charter schools since then. What evidence do you have that they haven't figured out like how to hire the right number of teachers in the last 7 years, right?
Yeah, and to that, even though there is no negative effect on traditional public schools, there actually is pretty substantial evidence that there's a positive effect on them through competition and innovation that is provoked once a charter school is nearby. So this is Cremata and Raymond from 2014. It's a few years ago, and it is specific to the District of Columbia, so you may just want to be ready to defend why it's relevant in the round. But this was a 4-year analysis that found that whenever there's a charter school nearby, if it's a quality charter school, traditional public schools will see 1.5 to 3 months more growth in math per year than they would at a traditional public school that didn't face any competition, and 2 to 4 months greater in reading gains than a traditional public school that didn't face any competition. But I think a better card is the Manhattan Institute in 2020. It was more nationwide. It looked at a number of different states, and it found that studies have consistently showed that whenever there is a charter school nearby, traditional public schools will respond, and it does provoke a competitive response in those traditional public schools to benefit the education of everyone, not just those attending charter schools. But even further, the Manhattan study cites a 2018 study that found that in New York City, even whenever a school is facing budgetary stress, they're still able to drive competition. They're still able to improve the lives of their students and keep their students there and the funding that they bring. So they found that even after they have budgetary stress, after a lot of their students may leave initially, they saw an increase in academic expectations, in school safety, student and parent engagement, and community and communication improved in those schools. So even if the con is trying to say, well, how in the world can they compete if they don't have this funding?
They are.
Yeah, empirically they are. This 2018 study shows that even if they're under budgetary stress, they can still compete.
Yeah, and I think exactly. So I think mining the Manhattan Institute for the prime, I wouldn't cite them direct. Well, actually, I would say that you can cite them directly for one particular card that we're looking at here on the screen. I wish you could see it, but there is one really good summary that they have, and I'll pop this up in a visual. Like, I do think citing the Manhattan Institute would be good for some of it, but what I'd really do is I'd go mine the primary sources that they have, in particular this New York study, because as Mia says, this is a perfect direct hit back on the idea that, well, they're losing money. And the answer is they are losing money, but they're also being faced with the need to compete and do a better job. And they're seeing models that work for charter schools nearby. And when you balance the two out, empirically, as a matter of fact, what we're seeing is that the incentive to compete and the better models are winning out. Like, whatever harm is coming from the budget is being outweighed by those incentives. And the other thing she said I thought was great, which is, over time, we're going to see, these effects go down anyway. So I think those are good responses to an argument you're going to encounter from con teams. Right?
For sure. And another response that you can have is you don't even have to spend money to compete. All you have to do is allocate your money more efficiently. Just move it around and make it more efficient so you can compete in that way too. So a school under budgetary stress can certainly still compete. So pretty much the thesis of this is remember, there are clearly individual cases where charter schools are succeeding, and as we've just cleared up, traditional public schools on the whole are not being harmed. So again, because it's voluntary, parents and students are always free to leave and go as they want. So even if there is a charter school that is failing, it's all voluntary. So there's no net loss here.
Yeah, I think the other thing that you probably have to be ready to hit back on is all of this evidence that we've read so far is about how there's no downside in terms of like measurable performance, statistical information about like, standardized test scores and stuff like that. I think you also have to be ready to push back on the idea of racial disparities and not being representative. So there is a study from Logan and Will in 2015 that talks about the potential for school resegregation as a result of charter schools. And they have some pretty good arguments about how that's just not empirically happening to any degree that would actually create a problem, right? So this is a study that will let you hit back and say, even if the percentage balances are changing by 2 and 3%, they're not changing in any amount that would make a school worse at, for example, socializing people and letting them meet people of other races. They're not happening to a degree that it jeopardizes community support. So I do think you need to be ready to hit back on those and some of the other impacts. But the point is, there is evidence out there on the pro that allows you to do that, right? And it allows you to run this case that says, if it's not making the overall system worse and some of these experiments are succeeding and you can walk away from the rest of them if you don't like them, then that's a win, right? You'd rather have a system where you have a chance at success and then you can always go back to the status quo of the old system anytime you like, than a system where all you have is the old system. Now, I will say, we could spend more time on the pro talking about some of these other arguments I had outlined, like, arguments about teacher diversity and arguments about commitment to college, outside financial support from corporations and other supporters, and parental support. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time in the video talking about those. We will try to link to some sources on that. And the reason I'm not is they, to me, feel very much like they are arguments about inputs that are not necessarily linked to outputs, right? And so I think your time is better spent looking at arguments about the effects that we have on measurable, quality of education issues. I'm not saying that you would not necessarily try to vary your case up and have an argument about, teachers who are of the same race as students. There is evidence out there about why that's good. And if you want to just have something that makes your opponent kind of respond to something different, that's fine. But if you want to vary things up, we will try to include some links. But I really do think you're going to want to be focused on outputs and statistics and how we can actually measure, better outcomes for people. So anything else on the pro?
I'm good to move on.
Okay, then we will turn to what I think is the stronger side of the resolution, which is the con. Okay, so on the con, I would say that my core theory, if I were debating, would be almost the inverse of what I said earlier on the pro, which is that if I'm the con, I am going to tell the judge that it is the pro's burden to show you that charter schools have demonstrably moved the needle on the quality of American education overall across the country, on balance in the United States, right? Going back to those terms. And there has to be some kind of discernible consensus that it has made the total system better. And judge, we're just going to show you that there is no such consensus, right? We're not going to tell you as the con that there are no good charter schools, right? We're not going to tell you that there's no study out there that shows some benefit from charter schools, here and there. What we're going to tell you is that the pro's burden is to show you that the needle has moved perceptibly, and the overwhelming consensus of like the experts on this, when they talk just generally in terms of meta terms about like when they talk about what does the data look like go back to the intelligence squared debate, watch the first few constructives that they give. Everybody pretty much agrees that all the data is like all over the place, right? And if we can show you, judge, that the data is all over the place, that the needle is not moving, reliably, consistently across the country, then we should win, right? And I think the con, more than the pro, benefits tremendously from saying, ignore the individual, cases, ignore this one study of 7 schools in DC. Those are just noise. That's not, what the resolution is looking at. Only look to the big national studies, and in particular, judge, only look to whether or not you are convinced that there is a reliable consensus in the data that things are getting better because of charters. And if the answer is no, vote con. And if the answer is I don't know, vote con, right? Either way. So the first thing we have to do if we're going to make that argument is to show, and I have this labeled in my notes as charter schools don't measurably improve educational outcomes, right? And I think the core argument is that overall the data shows no measurable difference in the educational performance of students while enrolled in a charter school. And there are a million different sources you can look to on this. There are a million different explanations. The one I happen to have comes from the Institute for Education Services. This is an evaluation brief of the charter school issue in 2019. And what it does is it just cites like 20 different studies, and it sums them up this way. Most research studies that examine groups of charter schools, including both urban and non-urban charter schools, suggest that on average, students who attend charter schools perform academically about as well as, but no better than, students at nearby traditional public schools. And then it goes on and talks at length about how, are there exceptions? Of course there are exceptions. There are reasons why they happen. There are reasons why in some cases they don't happen. But at the end of the day, there is no clear signal. There is no clear upward line on the graph as a result of going to a charter school. Now, there are many different places you can look for summaries like that. But frankly, I think you're better off as the con looking to these sort of meta-analyses, looking to these sort of overall assessments of the literature if you can find some. And we'll try to find some other ones in addition to the IES brief, finding them and finding credible people saying, look, we've looked at all the data, there is no clear upward trend. The overall consensus is it's about the same, right? So, but even if you look beyond just, for example, data on standardized test scores, and you look at other signals of like whether standardized tests whether charter schools are improving education, the evidence is muddled there too. So the same Institute for Educational Sciences study from 2019 asks, well, is there evidence that college outcomes are better as a result of going to a charter school? And you can see here, finding one, being admitted to a charter school did not affect students' college enrollment or completion. And then further findings, being offered admission to or attending a charter middle school did not affect students' chances of enrolling in college. Being offered admission to a charter middle school did not affect students' chances of obtaining a degree or still being enrolled in college at the end of the study period, right? So there's a lot of strong evidence that it doesn't make it any worse. It doesn't reliably make it any better, whatever your metric is, whether it's standardized tests, whether it's admission in college. And as we're going to talk about later, there's evidence that it may even make it worse in things like high school graduation. So, but what we have at the end of the day is, as the con, tons of contradictory evidence, and we as the con are okay with that. We kind of like it, because if it's contradictory, it's not doing enough to push the needle over the line for the pro. But let's just say, as the con, you really did want to show, that this is just not working. You wanted to have the simplest, like the phrase would be, cut the Gordian knot, right? From the mythological sort of fable. How do you cut this incredibly complicated knot? And sometimes how do you untie this knot? Sometimes you just have to cut it with a sword. So, one thing I don't know if I'd run my case around this, but one kind of rubric or heuristic that interested me is, why don't we just look at the overall performance of the U.S. education system during the period of time that charter schools have grown, and see if their growth has resulted in any notable improvement in the overall education system, right? So the first thing you'd say is charter school attendance going up? And the answer is, of course it is. The National Center for Education Statistics in 2020 says that we've seen, skyrocketing enrollment in charter schools over the last 20 years since about 2000. It's risen from about 1% to about 6% of students. Well, that's a massive increase. Lots and more students are going to these charter schools. And the question is, during that time, have we seen the overall performance of the U.S. education system go up or go down or stay about the same? And the short answer is, if you look at Brookings from 2017 and you look at other studies, if we look at international measures where the United States education system is measured against other countries in an objective way where we can't, game the system or anything like that, we see, for example, on the PISA, our scores in reading and math have gone down. Science has gone up just a little bit. Scores on the TIMSS have gone up just a tiny bit, but not very much during that time period. So, when we look at objective measures of how the United States education system is working, during the time period where charter schools have been the major reform effort, it hasn't moved the needle, right? Now, I don't know if I necessarily make this the framework of my case, because obviously the pro can come back and say, oh, well, there are all these countervailing factors. You can't just look to the overall performance of the education system. But this gives you kind of an overall rubric, kind of an overall heuristic of, like, you would think if we've been doing this experiment experiment for 25 years and we've seen millions of kids go through these schools, a significant percentage, there'd be some positive movement, and there really hasn't been. If anything, it seems to have gone the other direction, right? So, and we could spend a bunch of time talking about the different sources on this, but I think that is sort of the basic argument. The needle is not moving. That is kind of the core of the Kahn's case. Now, that said, there are many other ways that the Kahn can attack this. And, one of the most basic ones is the resource draining argument,
yeah,
right?
I think this is an argument that you're going to hear from pretty much every Kahn team, and I think you should be reading this argument because it's a pretty strong one, and it's definitely agreed on by even those who support charter schools. It's just pretty common knowledge to every side of this debate. Now, there are, of course, a lot of cards that you can read. Just the one that we happen to have is from Ladd and Singleton in 2018 that found that charter schools drain $500 per pupil remaining in traditional schools. And this is a problem because the fixed cost in those schools don't go down on a one-to-one ratio with the students who are leaving. So, for example, the cost to finance the lights staying on and to pay the principal and to pay the teachers that are still remaining isn't going to change. And the costs are not changing on a one-to-one basis with that. So the public schools are at a significant disadvantage once they lose that funding. Now, of course, you're going to have some evidence that links this to education quality and that shows that having less funding in a public school is actually going to adversely affect the quality of the students in that school's education. And there are, of course, a million different sources that you can use to support that claim.
Well, I would say, I had a little trouble, as we talked about earlier, some of that stuff from the Manhattan Institute suggests that maybe the loss of funds is offset, right? In other words, you don't see declining education. So that's the critical link there. And I think I don't have one in my notes right now, but we'll definitely try to find some and drop them in the links if we can. But I think that's the critical thing, because I think if all you do is you come in and say, funding is being lost.
Yeah.
That's not quite enough. Now, to be fair, if your judge is a teacher who's maybe not an experienced debate judge, the idea of funding loss in already underfunded public schools, that may be enough for them. But a more sort of rigorous, debate coach, type person is probably going to demand a link to some actual measurement of educational quality. So you need to really try to find one of those to make this argument really, really work.
Yeah. Another common argument I think you're going to see is that charter schools exacerbate racial and class disparities in educational outcomes. And a simple reason for this is that charter schools are extremely racially homogenous and much more so than their counterpart traditional public school. So this is from Whitehurst in 2017. This is a great card because he looks at a lot of the potentially mitigating factors that could affect racial composition and he factors those out. So he can conclusively tell you that the reason why these charter schools are so racially homogenous is because they exist as charter schools. So this card specifically says that charter schools have a substantially higher racial imbalance relative to their catchment area than traditional schools. And another card that you can read on this subject matter is from Frankenburg in 2010. It's a pretty long time ago, but this is just a pretty hard-hitting card that I think would really catch your judge's attention. It says, at the national level, 70% of Black charter school students attend intensely segregated minority schools, which is twice as many as the share of intensely segregated Black students in traditional public schools.
You need to be able to, and I think Zmia's going to talk about it in a second, you really need to be able to explain, so first of all, the word segregation sounds really bad, and it is bad, right? I mean, that in and of itself, the fact of segregation is, for many judges, if unexamined, going to be enough of an impact by itself. Yeah. But a good pro team is going to hit back and say, well, but the public schools in these areas are kind of segregated too. So why does it matter if a charter school is if the public schools are 80% African American, and then the charter schools are 85% African American because fewer white people go there? Why does that even matter? What is the relevance of that? And you've got to be able to answer that. And there are ways to answer that.
Yeah, and we'll give you an answer in just a second. But you're also, like he said, you're going to have to be able to link this to the quality of education. Now, we can't just assume that all of our judges are going to understand why this is bad for education. Many of them will, but you're going to need to read some evidence on this. So Again, there's a lot of evidence about how segregation is bad for educational outcomes, but the card that we have is from Reardon in 2015. This is just a pretty good summary of all the major literature that found that the more a school is racially out of proportion, the worse performance you tend to see in those schools. Now, remember, like I said later, if you're going to want to use an argument like this, you want to tailor your definition of the quality of education to an argument like this. We have a definition that you can use. It's from UNESCO that defines quality of education as the equity of access and outcome as part of the framework for what is a quality education. So this is just one definition that you can use to accommodate a contention like this. I do think you are going to hear a lot of pros telling you, look, like Brett said, a lot of the public schools are just as segregated. At the very least, we're giving minority students an opportunity. We're giving them a better future. How I would respond to that is that even if minority students can benefit from a charter schools actually exist as a distraction from effectively integrating our public schools. And you don't have to believe this card. I think you should read through it because I think it has a lot of merit. This is from Andre Prairie in 2017. He's a fellow in the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. And he essentially explains that charter schools exist as this placebo for integration. And the reason why is that they told us at their founding that because they weren't bound by traditional district lines and students had the option to come, that they would be incredibly diverse and that they would have a wide array of students, not just in mindset and in education, but also in race. But what we see today, as we've laid out the evidence, they're not as racially diverse as they claimed they once were. But Perry explains that because we have this placebo, because we have this sense of security in our minds that we are effectively integrating our public schools, we've essentially given up that fight and we've actually moved away from the process to integrate our public schools. I think this is a great response because I think it effectively outweighs any, educational benefit that the pro could bring up. Long-term segregation in the school system is definitely outweighs maybe a marginal, at best, marginal benefit in the education for students on the pro side.
I will say, I love the idea, and it's tough to make this point. I tried, believe me, in my research, I tried. I love the idea of if you can sell the judge on what we're comparing charter schools to is not just the status quo at the public school, traditional public school down the street. Mm-hmm. It is what we would have done if we hadn't wasted 25 years on this failed experiment, right? And it's hard to find evidence that talks like that, but the Perry card that she's talking about at least makes an effort in that direction. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting it is easy to persuade a judge against a good team that had we not done charter schools, we would have gone in and effectively integrated our public schools. But we would have had the argument he makes is we would have had a better chance, right? Because charter schools have made us believe this fiction that, well, because, you can go to any charter school you want, that we're sort of integrating, and we're not really. And, if you can sell the judge on that, then you can link to a fundamentally different comparison. You're not just comparing to the school down the street, you're comparing to a better world where we actually did the things we needed to do to fix the real problem of de facto segregation in our schools. Again, is it a little bit of a Hail Mary to make that link? Yes, but if you do, you score a touchdown. It's like a really, really huge impact.
Yeah.
So next on my agenda would be the argument that charter schools are cherry picking their students. There's a really good Reuters article from back in 2013 and called Class Struggle, How Charter Schools Get the Students That They Want. There are also some pretty good blogs. I wouldn't cite these blogs, but they have some links and lists of sources. So we may put them in the links below about how even though charter schools are not legally supposed to be going out and recruiting students based on ability. I mean, that would defeat the purpose, right? That would just be like an elite school, right? They nonetheless find ways to do it kind of off the books or informally. They don't do it formally, but they do it formally, right? And there are actually a few states, I think 4 or 5, that do allow certain types of ability-based admissions, but most of the time admission is by lottery, right? But if you know anything about systemic bias in society, it doesn't take formal legalized, discrimination to have a discriminatory effect. So what the Reuters report talks about is how you have, for example, these very lengthy, intricate, involved applications that involve, 5 essays for the kid and 7 essays for the parent, and how there are charters that don't accept federal lunch funds. So, how is a poor kid going to be able to eat lunch? They don't offer transportation. They do a bad job with disabled students or English language learners, and they kind of have a reputation for that, so people don't want to go there. And what all of these technically non-selective things do is they add up to allowing these schools to, dodge bringing in weaker students and effectively cherry pick the stronger students that they want, right? Now, there are two impacts. If you can establish that that's true from the Reuters report or from another source, there are two impacts. The smaller impact from that is, well, it's just bad for education if one school takes all the strong students and leaves the weaker students, for someone else to deal with. It's bad for, having a diversity of folks. It's bad to leave your burdens for a different school if students are, weaker students. But the much, much better impact from this is, judge, call every single statistic that the pro uses into question, right? If the judge buys that a significant amount of cherry picking students is going on, and the margins for better or worse are like 1% or 2% or 3%, which is what we see in all of these studies. Well, you can easily explain a 1, 2, 3% variation in student performance away by getting better students. At the moment the judge buys the idea that you are cherry picking students because they're even a little bit stronger, you can in their mind, wipe the entire impact of much of the pro's evidence completely out of existence. And this dovetails with the second but related argument, which is that charters are underserving disabled students and English language learners. So, for example, the Center for Research on Educational Outcomes, or CREDO, their 2013 study shows that traditional public schools are serving about 12% disabled students. I think today there's newer data that is more like 13%, whereas charter schools are down around 8%, maybe 9% today, right? And so what you're seeing is that doesn't seem like a lot, but it's 50% more, right? And again, remember the total numbers that we're seeing are 1, 2, 3% differences. If traditional public schools are serving 50% more disabled students, and by the way, this is not in any way knocking disabled students, it's just disabled students tend to be more expensive to educate. You have to buy equipment, you have to have special, in some cases, individualized education plans, you have to hire more teachers. It just takes more resources to educate them. We're not in any way attacking them, we're just saying these schools get to avoid the more expensive students, right? If they, or they manage to. Now, legally, to be clear, legally, charters are not supposed to exclude anybody. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is something I deal with in my job, routinely, says you can't. But the reality is, these schools develop a reputation for doing a bad job with disabled students, and why would and they're actually perfectly happy with that. Why would they want to have a good reputation for that? Parents just decide not to send their kids there. And there's also some interesting evidence from Bergman and McFarlin in 2020 that what these schools will quietly, informally ignore like requests for information about disabled students, that they're like certain percentage more likely to just like ignore an email, right, about like inquiring about whether disabled students can get their needs met in those cases. And again, that doesn't sound like a lot, like being 7% more likely, but again, if your impact is 1, 2, 3% and you're doing these little things to have slightly fewer expensive students, right, it explains a lot, right? And similar arguments can be made about, for example, English language learners, because again, that's a group that requires a specialized curriculum, additional teachers, it costs more to do. English language learners may have difficulty on English sections of standardized tests and may pull, even though they're very smart people who will end up being very capable, they might pull those scores down, right, and those sorts of things. And if you're able to effectively sort of deter those folks from coming to your school, you're going to have an unfair advantage, right? And I think all of this links back to the idea that we are going to call all of Pro's wonderful statistics into question by making judges believe that these schools are picking and choosing the best, or at least the least expensive, right, in order to make their burden lighter. In terms of other just specific impacts, there are a number. For example, charter schools have lousy graduation rates. This is from Prothero and Harlan 2019, talking about how a disproportional number of charter schools had very low graduation rates. I'll just read a little bit. An analysis of federal data by the Education Week Research Center identified 935 public high schools with 4-year graduation rates less than 50%. The most recent year was 2016-17. That's when it comes from. Of those, 54% of them are charter schools. Remember, charter schools make up less than 10% of the total population of schools, but they are 54% of the schools with less than 50% graduation rates. And they're not just a one-time blip. Charter schools have suffered from chronically low graduation rates below 50% since 2010-2011. Now, to be fair, there are arguments about how some of these charter schools are, designed to deal with at-risk students, but I don't have the data on that. I would be very surprised if a pro had really excellent data about how huge percentages of charter schools are to deal with at-risk students. That's not why, for example, for-profit companies go into business. They don't go into business to, do, sort of social justice work along those lines. And, here again, the impact on this, I think, is important, which is, I think high school graduation is a really nice metric to use if you can get to it, because it sort of says like, look, Judge, you've heard all this stuff about standardized tests and all this stuff, but what does a standardized test matter if you don't graduate from high school? I mean, graduating from high school is the most important line between very difficult life and a life where you at least have a chance at some degree of prosperity and success. And these schools, a disproportionate number of these schools, certainly not all, we know that, but a disproportionate number of these schools are falling way, way, way short and really doing a disservice to these students. And so, you can ignore impacts like little marginal blips on, 3% higher in a standardized test score if these kids are not getting a high school diploma. And I think that's a really nice potential impact. Another one that I like is the idea that charter schools are not really innovating. The whole thing that we were sold for charter schools back in the 1990s, and I'm old enough to vaguely remember this. I'm old enough to remember doing like bills in student congress about this and seeing people in my state debate whether to have charter schools, was the idea that they're going to be like these little examples of the free market, right? We're going to fund them with government funds, but we're going to take away all the regulations and let them try all these different experiments where they do education in different ways, right? And they're going to do all these great innovations. And if you had asked somebody in like 1995 when I was in high school, right, like, what do you think it'll look like in 2020? They'd probably say, a proponent of charter schools, they'd say, oh, we're going to have all these incredible innovations. These thousands of schools will come up with all these little things and they'll copy each other, and eventually public schools will copy them, and we'll see all these great innovations, and education by the year 2020, 25 years from now, will be completely transformed, right? That was what we were sold and what we were told. But if you look, for example, the Spencer Foundation in 2015 has data about whether these schools are actually innovating, and I'm not going to read it, it's lengthy, but they basically say there's very little actual innovation going on in these schools. They're box checking. They're trying to get their standardized tests up. They're living within the system that exists. Maybe it's not their fault, but they're not doing a lot of innovation. And I think the argument here is like the basic promise that we were given. Like, why would we bother having a second redundant education system that siphons money from the first education system unless it was going to do something pretty freaking remarkable? And the answer is it hasn't. And we were talking earlier about how, one thing I might do in crossfire on this, if I'm the con, is just say, okay, something along these lines, is challenge the pro to tell us what are the great innovations that have come from charter schools. Like to say, okay, the theory behind charter schools was we were going to see market forces and competition and removal of regulations. It was going to give us all this innovation. And all these schools were going to see these innovations and copy them, and the education world was going to be, revolutionized. So tell me, pro, what are the great innovations in education and teaching that have come out of charter schools? Just tell me. And we've had 25 years. That's plenty of time. What are the great substantive innovations that we have gotten from charter schools? What are they? Just list them for me. And I don't think they'll be able to do it, right? I don't think you can. This core tenet of what charter schools are supposed to be just really hasn't come to pass. And then the last thing I have on the con is I have this really nice article. It's more of a block, but it's something I wanted to apprise you of. It's not really an argument. This is from Robin Lake, the director of CRPE, which is one of the, if not the single biggest academic proponent of charter schools. And she's just got this really candid, frank article that she wrote this year in 2020, where she basically admits that this whole thing about how competition making all the schools better has not happened, and how charter schools have really not lived up to their potential, and how they've been hamstrung by all these different limitations. And she kind of makes excuses for them. But remember, as we said earlier, it doesn't matter why charter schools aren't benefiting. It's just that they're not. And to have the director of the biggest advocacy group for academic advocacy group for charter schools out there admitting in spring 2020 that these things are just not doing what we expected them to do, that's a nice little thing to put in your back pocket, especially where she's basically saying that, hey, remember this whole thing where we said these schools would compete and they would, like, public schools would compete with charter schools and everybody would get better? Yeah, that hasn't happened, right? To have that admission from her is pretty damning, and I thought that was pretty nice. So I thought that was a nice potential impact. So anyway, that's what I got on the con. Anything else?
One thing that I was going to say is just I think cons really need to hold their pros accountable, like really hold their feet to the fire, because there are going to be a lot of theoretical arguments and a lot of arguments about, economic theory and these fairy tales of markets happening and competition. And of course, those things sound really great on paper, but they haven't come to fruition in the real world. So make them actually show you that those things are happening. And if they can't, then you win the round.
Yeah, emphasize to your judge when you're on the con, show me present tense empirical evidence that your experiment, call it that, call charter schools an experiment, right? Show me concrete, you've had 25 years, I like that phrase too, you've had a quarter of a century, you guys have been the major education reform of the last quarter century, show me results, show me the money, right? I mean, not the money, but show me the results, right? And if you can't, I don't want to hear, you've had way too long. First of all, the resolution isn't about what you might do, it's about what you have done. And second, you've had way, way too long to be up in here talking about some magic pie in the sky free market theory that might work at some point in the future. Either show us what you've done or it's, vote con. So I think that's a great point. So with that, we will move to some final thoughts. Okay, so final thoughts really quickly. Again, congratulations on making it to NSDA. I know that this probably isn't the way you hoped to do NSDA. I had honestly hoped to go out to Albuquerque and do the Breaking Bad tour. I really wanted to give that a try, but alas, it was not to be this year. But a few things, to sort of get you through this unique historical event that you are privileged to be a part of. The first one is, as I say in almost every closing final thought, is you really need to know what your story is that you're telling to the judge. Now, to win at this tournament, you're going to have to go far afield and debate a lot of different things. But if you don't have a home base to come back to on the pro and on the con of a core theory that you really are selling to them from the beginning to the end, especially with a disproportionate number of lay and community judges in the judging pool, you're going to have a hard time lasting 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and beyond rounds, right? It's going to be really hard to get there and get the wins and get the ballots that you need if you don't have a core theory. The second thing I'll say, and it's kind of related to that, which is that if you don't have, if you find yourself in one of these just all out machine gun, source fights where you're challenging people on sample sizes and there's no rhyme or reason to it and you're not stopping to tell the judge's story and you don't get those ballots or you lose that round, you got nobody to blame but yourself, right? You've got to try, no matter how messy and fast it gets, to be the team that pulls it back. Go back and watch final rounds and other out rounds from NSDA tournaments in not only public forum, but Lincoln Douglas and even policy debate. There are no teams that make it to late out rounds that don't have the ability to do this. So if you are not having clear, coherent stories and talking points, talk to your parents, talk to your coaches, see what they buy, right? See what they believe, right? Especially if they're not like super rigorous, experienced debate coaches, see what kind of stories they believe and make that a part of your presentation. Good speaking is important, slow it down, be a good speaker. That's important in NSDA. But those are my thoughts on how you can do well here. And again, congratulations.
Yeah, I was thinking pretty similarly. Just remember, of course, you've got to prep and know your stuff. You've got to be able to, know more than your opponent. You've got to be ready and prepared. But also, just remember, you have to be able to tell that story, and you are going to have the capabilities to beat very good technical debaters if you're able to do this. Just remember, the person who can actually clear up the story at the end of the round, make it very easy for the judge to have that decision, to have a very clear-cut decision, is the team that's going to have that clear story. By summary and final focus, you just keep reiterating exactly what that thesis is. Another thing I wanted to say is, I know it's an online tournament. It's very easy for you to slack off right now, to just lay in bed. I know I was certainly doing it at the end of the semester with online classes. But remember, you've made it this far, and this is still NSDA. It's just as prestigious as it would be.
It's not going to be any different on a resume or college application or anything like that.
And it's also not going to be any easier. These great, really awesome teams that you see in the finals and that you see in out rounds in previous years are going to be prepping their butts off for this tournament. So don't slack off. You've made it this far. Just continue and you'll do great at the tournament.
Okay. Well, with that, again, congrats on making it this far on what has truly been a great season for you. We will watch with interest to see how things go. Hopefully get to watch some of those final rounds online. And if you do get into the finals, give us a shout out and a thank yous. But at any rate, other than that, though, we will look forward to seeing you for what hopefully will be a fantastic, mostly in-person debate season next year. And with that, we will sign off with our usual work hard, have fun, and hail state.